If you enjoy this podcast, have you made a one-time donation or become a Patreon member? I ask because for all the episodes released so far, totaling millions of downloads and listens, this show has been supported by under 500 people in the last 6 years, an average of less than one per episode. Will you take today to make a difference for permaculture? Make a one-time donation online by going to paypal.me/permaculturepodcast. If you prefer to send something in the mail, that address is The Permaculture Podcast, P.O. Box 16, Dauphin, Pennsylvania, 17018. Or, if you prefer, you can become an ongoing Patreon supporter and receive unique rewards for your monthly contribution. Find out more and sign up today by going to patreon.com/permaculturepodcast. How do we prepare for end of life? How do we honor the dead? How do we care for the living through our rites and rituals after a loved one passes? Michael Judd joins me to answer these questions as he shares the very personal story of his father's passing and how his family went about establishing a home cemetery. He helps us navigate what to do in order to create our own home burial site, how to clear it with local officials, laws, and regulations, how to provide access in perpetuity, and how to legally and properly inter the deceased. From there, we continue the conversation as we look at how we can prepare for our own end of life by creating an advanced directive, the options for green burial, and the need for all of us to start having honest and open conversations about death, regardless of our age. We then bring the episode to a close with a series of listener questions. Enjoy this conversation with Michael, and I'll join you again afterward. Then, Michael, since you've been a guest on the show before, I don't need your biography and background. I'll go ahead and point people to our earlier conversations if they'd like to find out more about you. But since it has been a while since we've spoken, would you like to give an update on you and your life since the publication of your book?
Well, the biggest thing has been building our round wood, timber frame, circular straw bale home, which took us about 5 years, a year in the design and planning and cutting and peeling, stacking the wood. We built the house from all the woods surrounding us. So it's mostly tulip poplar, cherry, black locust. And it took about 4 years to build. It really kind of took over life there. So I've been very busy doing that, and not so much time in my food forests, which has been an interesting observation in that they've done beautifully. They've been very productive and little to no maintenance. I've had no time to put into them, and they flourished. The 2 years leading up to building the house, I put in the bones, the swales, the hugelkultur beds, the food forest patches, planted everything up, and it really has proven itself to be resilient and work wonderfully. That wasn't my design or my intent, but that's the way it rolled out. So I've been busy with that. We've held 2 annual Pawpaw Festivals now at our homestead, which have both been really amazing events. Big turnout, huge excitement and interest in the pawpaw. And then when folks come, it's not just the pawpaw that's being celebrated. It's, the food forest tours, the gardens, the straw bale house. We do an open house for the Pawpaw Festival. And the house is really a piece of art. It's earthen floors throughout the whole house, all earthen interior plasters, traditional lime plasters on the outside, a thriving green roof, and passive cooling. We have gray water and compost toilet. It's all coated. It's a beauty, and very grateful that it's mostly done.
You run through those experiences of the owner-builder in putting your house together, but then after all those long years of work, you also get to reap the rewards of knowing it intimately, as well as having been such a close part of that construction and getting to enjoy it then into the future.
And yes, and it's really easy to live in. It was not easy to build, but it's easy to live in because the design was there up front, like the food forest, in the sense that for heating our house, we have a loft, and I think with the loft, the house is about 1,300 square feet. And we heat the whole house with a finished designed masonry stove, and you only fire it at the most every 12 hours, with one armful of wood, and that heat relays through and heats the whole house beautifully. So the amount of energy input and work for heating the house is minimal. And then the house stays beautifully cool in the summer, largely due to the living roof, which blocks the heat gain through the roof, which is where most homes gain heat. And then thick walls also keep it cool. And then the humidity levels in the house are almost non-existent when it's very humid. We're in the mid-Atlantic here. It's tropical in the summertime. But when you walk into the earthen house, all of the plasters on the wall and all of the earth in the house helps absorb excess humidity and releases and holds and releases and balances the interior environment to where it feels wonderful in there. So it's the opposite of having a cold blowing air conditioning on you or heat really flying at you. It's very comfortable and very easy to live in now.
You're not too far away from me. I'll have to come down sometime, do a video tour of your house, and we can have a longer conversation about what it was like to build your home, and we can share some of these ideas and technologies with folks.
I'd love that. I'd love it.
But with that, the reason that I have you here today is to talk about natural burials and establishing one's own family graveyard or community graveyard. And my understanding is that that comes from your personal experiences with your father, who I regret to hear had passed, having gotten to meet him when I was down and did our first interview together. He and I had quite an engaging conversation over lunch.
I remember that. I was thinking about that. It was about 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so, 4 years ago, my dad got diagnosed with mesothelioma. He'd had asbestos exposure when he was in the Navy. He was in submarines. And it caught up to him after all these years. And he lived with that mesothelioma for 18 months, which is quite a long time. And to show what an amazing being he is, he said that that last year of his life was one of the best he ever had. And even though his body deteriorated, his soul and his eyes, they shone beautifully. It was quite an amazing time for our whole family to be together and to be around him. And he was so positive and taught us so much in his process of dying that has really guided my understanding of death and life hugely. And during this time, we'd been talking with hospice at a certain point, and they brought us a sheet of paper that had all the sort of the considerations for joining hospice. And at the very back of the sheet on the bottom, it said that home burial is a possibility and an option. And that brought the conversation for our family. I still remember us, in the kitchen, my dad included, in the kitchen talking about the idea of creating, a home cemetery. We have about 25 acres of woodland here in Frederick, Maryland. But I'll get to it, but you don't need very much land to be able to do a home cemetery. And, so we all had to kind of be on the same page with it. My brother and my sister and my mom, all of us in the immediate family, and of course my dad. And they said, yes, let's explore it. Let's learn, what it takes to do this. And so, I took it up. This was something I was leading. And I was expecting to find all kinds of challenges in doing it. So first I called the health department. And they say, well, we'll come on out and we'll talk to you. And they came out and they wanted to see the proposed area. So we'd kind of select an area off the sort of zone 1, zone 2 area around the house, just going into the woods where the tree cover was light. And so we chose about a quarter acre there, just on our own, saying, okay, well, this looks like a good area. So the health department came out and said, okay, you're 100 foot from your well, you're 100 foot from, a riparian zone, creek or stream. And he's like, you're fine. As far as we care, the health department, you're fine. So that was that, and I was amazed. I was like, okay, well, then, what do I do next? The next step was getting a surveyor, calling up a local surveyor and saying, I would like to create a plat that delineates this area that we want to create a home cemetery in. So they came out and, they staked it and went and drew up the plat and then also created an easement, an access from the existing driveway that's already there. So the plat then was registered with the permit office downtown. And along with that plat being submitted, there was a write-up that just kind of explained. Now, we had a lawyer write it up, but you do not have to have a lawyer write it up. And it's just explaining that this plat is a home cemetery that will always have access regardless of who buys the land in the future. This will always have access to the family and people related to those who were buried there. And that was it. I couldn't believe it that was it. Nobody else was, coming around and checking on what we were doing with the site. Nobody dictated how deep we were supposed to dig the graves. I mean, it was surprisingly easy. Now, a lot of times when I would call the health department or the permit office, they would say, let us check, because they had not had the experience of creating, home cemeteries, in the last 40, 50 years. So they would go and check and get back to me and say, yes, you can. And, I knew I could, but I had to wait for everyone to go through the process of figuring and finding that out just because it's not been done. So that was kind of the forethought part in getting the land and getting the green burial site, the home burial site, sort of legally registered and ready for, for whomever's to come. And a quarter acre can fit a lot of people. And I think that the only cost we had was for the surveyor, which was maybe $1,500, $2,000. And that was the one-time cost for potentially, 30, 40 burials that will take place on this lot. So you do the math, that's pretty cheap, especially compared to, conventional burials these days. So that was the outline, and very surprisingly easy.
Now, is that simplicity of this process as a result of your local rules and regulations, or in your research for this, have you found similar kind of structures elsewhere?
Yes. Now, what most people do not know, and why I've begun to, hold talks about natural burial. Natural burial is kind of an overarching term for green burial, for home burial. They kind of fall under natural burial as a natural way. So, generally speaking, I think all states in the United States, you are allowed to keep your loved ones at home, after they die. There's no law saying that you have to remove somebody who's, at your home. I mean, unless there's circumstances, dubious death or contagious disease, you are allowed to keep your loved ones at home before burial. Then I think almost all states, excluding a small handful, and I can tell you what those are, you are allowed to have home burials, and you are allowed to act as your own funeral director. So that's huge. You do not need to be involving or paying anybody in the process of burying your loved ones. And so here are the states that do require a funeral director, and that's Alabama, Connecticut, Illinois, Indiana, Louisiana, Michigan, Nebraska, New Jersey, and New York. Now, if you live in one of those states, it's still worthwhile learning, what restrictions apply, because there might still be ways to work in and out of that system. Now, I also read somewhere that I think all funeral homes are required to accept any casket that you bring. Now, no one's going to tell you that, but so you could make your own willow, your own, sawn lumbered casket, something with low impact. And if you are going to have a conventional burial through a funeral home, you can bring your own casket, and they have to accept it. And that right there is a huge savings, both economic and environmental. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But yeah, most states, though most people don't know about it, and it's not practiced very much, you can have home burial. You can act as your own funeral director. A great resource for looking up all kinds of information about home burial and local laws, regulations, is the National Home Funeral Alliance. They're at homefuneralalliance.org. Wonderful nonprofit, really just about helping people realize that they can do this at home. And they have pamphlets and things to guide you through the steps and processes in doing it. So there's a lot of resources out there for doing this on your own at home. And then, of course, there's the other category of green burial, which usually is, at a green burial cemetery or a hybrid cemetery that's now allowing green burial. And we can talk more about that as well. But I'd like to also cover the process that we went through in caring for my father and burying my father.
I'd certainly like to hear more about that, because when you reached out to me to want to talk more about this topic, what came to mind is that as we practice permaculture as a system of holistic design, that, we started in the landscape for so long, and that's what Bill brought out into the world. It's what he and David were writing about. But as we begin to apply this more broadly to creating permanent civilization, permanent culture, that we need to be doing more planning about our entire life, our entire society. And in doing so, to be thinking about these rituals of birth as well as death, and that if we're going to be doing so, to be designing for end of life, to be able to hold the dying and care for the family afterwards. And that's where I would really like to hear more about your story and what you went through, because it's such a personal experience.
I think it's definitely a part of any design. It should be. It's an inevitable part of our lives and our environment. And I'm surprised how much it's not talked about. I don't know how many PDCs I've been a part of or been around, and I cannot really remember once anybody talking about designing space or process for burial, which I think is kind of a huge oversight in planning. And it's kind of ironic, for birth. We do so much. I mean, how many pre-visits and how many, preparations go through someone, being ready to be born. Whereas, the other inevitability in life is that you're going to die. And there's really no conversation. There's no planning. And I think that's also why the funeral industry has boomed in the last 60, 70 years, because it's gaining by the default of people having not a plan in place. Because you don't want to have to think about these things, when somebody dies. You're not in the right mental state to make clear decisions, so you just hand it off. And you hand off a lot. You hand off time and process, ritual that help with grieving, and then you spend a lot of money, and you add to environmental toxic loads through the processes of conventional funeral homes. So I think anybody, a permaculturist or anyone who just has a love for the planet and the environment, should be having this conversation, should be looking at planning and thinking about. And I'll talk about cremation later, but cremation has a huge footprint as well. This really needs to be thought about if you care about the environment, you care about your loved ones. This is really critical. Anyway, I'll share my story in hopes that maybe it shines some light on one way it can be done. So, as I said, my father, a very strong soul, embraced his death and really shone through his last days. It was pretty amazing. And he had hospice care. He was at home. And, he died early in the morning in February, 2.5 years ago. And we were all there. And we'd been planning for it. But as much as you plan, it's still hard to begin, knowing what to do. We had been reading a resource guide by Crossings, is another nonprofit that really focuses on home funeral care. So caring for your loved ones at home. It's not necessarily about burial. It's about how do you care for the body and the loved one. How do you prepare space and hold space, during the 2 or 3 days after somebody dies. So I really recommend checking them out. They're at crossings.net. So we've been reading that and, reading about setting up the space. And even so, the morning of, I reached out to a friend of mine, a very spiritually centered woman in our lives, and asked her to come help. So she did. And that was enormous help to us. Sometimes folks that do this are called death doulas. And there's actually training for becoming a death doula in helping people in this time of transition with loved ones. And it's really quite simple, but it's helpful to have somebody who's a little bit more clear in guiding the process. So my father died here at home, and we moved him into our living room. And some of us were wanting to be with him and to wash his body, to change his clothes, to put a beautiful quilt over him, to set up the space with candles and pictures, rose water, just kind of creating a really sort of sacred, peaceful space around him and for us. Some of us weren't comfortable doing that. Some of us went out and started digging the grave. And that was a huge process and help for some people. And then others, just wanted to, make food in the kitchen. So it was helpful that there was so many different things to do, because I've learned through this that ritual, which I used to think was something, it's complicated, or you had to learn something special culturally. And what it means to me now is just doing anything that helps you process. In our case, grief. And, any little thing we were doing was helping us through our process. So throughout the morning, we washed and dressed, and then some of us sat with my dad. And we kept that space for 3 days. We sat and stayed with my dad for 3 days. Now, I had heard and read many cultures, say that they wait 3 days until they bury somebody. And then there's a transition period, for the soul. And I was like, okay, that sounds, plausible. But I got to actually experience that being so, where, you could see the transition of my father shifting and changing to where I would not have been comfortable burying him until the third day. On the third day, he was gone. He was clear and felt. And then it was a comfortable time, to bury him. But, I juxtapose that against what normally happens. People get afraid. Somebody dies and think they have to do something immediately. They think they have to call somebody, the funeral director, the doctor, hospital, something, 911. I don't know. People they don't sit with death. And I think that's a huge loss. The funeral home usually comes and whisks, the body away within a couple hours of dying. Then you're left with an empty home, and that body, that life, that loved one of yours is still in transition, but now it's in a cooler. Maybe it's getting filled with embalming fluid. It's not in loving hands. So I think it's very important, regardless of how you end up being buried, that having time at home with your loved one is hugely important for them and for you. Now, we also had a vigil, which again is kind of, I used to think was a big thing, a big term, but really it was just letting everybody know that they were invited to come over to have a chance to say goodbye to my father and to support us as a family. And I think that was on the second night. And we definitely have some Irish blood in us, but not something we practice culturally, but it certainly helped because there's a lot of whiskey flowing. And a lot of people showed up. It was wonderful. There must have been 50, 60 people in our house. It was almost like, one of our holiday parties. And my dad was, there in the center of it all. And it gave an opportunity for other people to come and have time with him before he was buried. And that was really important. In a really comfortable, familiar, setting where we all got to enjoy being together and celebrate him in that way, which was definitely not conventional, but I think that's what was great about it. And then on the third day, it was just our family. We didn't have anybody religious come and help us with the process at all. So what I did after the grave was dug, and the grave was just dug probably about 4 feet. There was no code saying you had to do it this or that. So I guess people dug till they felt like they were done. And it wasn't very big. It was just big enough for his body. And what I did is I created a very simple carrying board, which was a 2x10 board, maybe 5 or 6 feet long. And I just I screwed on a couple 2x2s underneath it so that it created 4 handles. And we put my dad on that. And then we used my leftover fabric from my sister's wedding dress, which was probably like 20 years ago. Beautiful silk. And we just wrapped my father's body around the board so that they stayed, kind of tied him to it. And then, as a family, we gathered around him inside. And we talked about him and what he meant to our lives. And then we carried him out, a little procession up into the woods by the grave, and we just got some rope, and we just lowered the board and my father down into the bottom of the grave, pulled the ropes out, and again stood there in a circle, and mother read a poem, and those who wanted to speak spoke, and then we just started filling in the grave. It was not an easy part. but it was wonderful that, that we were all there, and his grandchildren, my nieces and nephews were there, from age 4 to maybe 14. And this was their first experience of death and process. And it was very healthy in the way that all of us were there and supporting each other and related to it. And then I kind of made a fire pit there beside my dad's grave and sat there with my uncles and cousins and my brother and sister and drank whiskey. And, I didn't want to leave, but it just all that opportunity, I just wanted every second, every minute I could to process. And we did it as much as we could, and I could still use more. And time does still allow the process to happen. But I was just very grateful that we could do all of that without interference. And then 1 month later, my grandmother, my dad's mother, died. And she was waiting for him to go. And so then there we go again. We did the whole process again and buried her next to him. So right off, we buried 2 of our loved ones right here on our land, and we'll all be buried there. It's a good feeling. And my father, my grandmother being right there, I go by that every day, and I get to just think about them, be reminded of them in a good way. And we made it beautiful in the woods. We created a really nice stone-lined path going in. We created a couple small terraces out of Pennsylvania stone, local stone. For the markers, we just used like a boulder that I had engraved. For my grandmother, and we put a bird bath. She loved birds, so we put a bird bath there for her marker. A friend of ours makes these beautiful clay bells that we hung on some black locust posts so that you can ring them as you come and go out of the space. And it's just surrounded by spice bush. It's just this magical little space to also be, to go and be peaceful in yourself, as well as have an opportunity to go and have a conversation, or just, I go in there sometimes and just start talking to my dad. It just creates a nice space for that.
How did this experience, and I understand that you had a good relationship with your father, that this was someone who you were close to, so I'm sure that it had a serious impact on you when he passed, but how did this burial experience, this ritual that you engaged in, how did that feel compared to other funerals and burials that you've been to?
It is very, very different. The other funerals I've been to, you go to the funeral home where they have a chapel in there. Oftentimes the body is there on view. It's been embalmed and covered in makeup and just looks weird, man. It looks weird. It's kind of freaky. And it's nice that people are getting together, but I don't know. There just seems to be a lack of opportunity for healthy grieving and process. I mean, it's not easy, and I know that we have a unique opportunity in family and strength that has allowed us to do this, and I understand that a lot of families do not have that internal strength to do this. But there are other options. There are, hybrid options for doing this. Ours was kind of ideal and, full on. And I think there's different sides to it. The difference, there's the emotional side, and then there's the environmental side as well. They're both hugely important. And when you have a conventional burial, you're using a huge amount of resources, as your last play on the planet. Yeah, I think I read recently, it says, why should your green consciousness end when your life does? And that's interesting, and I think a lot of people who do care about the environment but are not planning, when they die, their family members are not have that same sort of environmental consciousness. They're going to make decisions. They're going to say, okay, well, let's cremate, which has a huge impact. Cremation, you have to be burned at 1,800 degrees for at least an hour. So you're talking a huge resource of energy pool. And then you're off-gassing mercury and metals and all kinds of chemicals into the environment. So, you're creating a huge, footprint in cremation. And I think a lot of people think, oh, well, that's going to be, less of an environmental impact. And it might be a little bit less, but it's still intense. So, I want to put it out there. If people were thinking about cremation, that is still an environmental impact. compared to doing a natural, burial. And then a lot of people are cremated in coffins. So you get put in this hardwood coffin, and then they burn you in that coffin. I think a lot of times the funeral homes are just looking for anything they can add into the price of the funeral, which adds up a lot. We're talking $10,000+ for a conventional funeral. I know cremation's a lot cheaper. Cremation could be more around $1,000, $1,500, so you're saving money. But most people that are getting conventional burials, and I've got some really interesting stats here just from the U.S. In the U.S. every year, I think something like 3.5 million people die, and most all of those are getting conventionally buried. And within just 1 year, just in the U.S., 800,000 gallons of embalming fluid are put into the earth. 30 million board feet of hardwoods. That's the equivalent of 4 million acres of wood. And that's enough wood to build 4.5 million single family homes. Remember, this is just 1 year. This is 1 year, one country. 180,000 pounds of steel is used in the caskets. That's enough to build over 200 Empire State Buildings. Again, this is just 1 year. And then now in conventional burials, what they do is they bury you in the casket, and then they put an inverted concrete vault over the casket. Now they do this so that the ground won't slump and the lawnmowers will have problems, right? And these are huge, structures of concrete. I've seen them. And in the U.S. alone, 6 billion tons of concrete is used. And that's enough to pave a sidewalk to the moon. I mean, it's insane. I mean, that is so much resource that is going into, and chemicals that are going into burying. So if you are not planning ahead, if you have not clearly stated and written your wishes for when you die, then you will be, adding to this. It's probably guaranteed. If you don't have a plan in place, then this is probably what is going to be your path. And you'll be pulling resources as your last act.
And this is one of the things that you and I talked about as part of this long-term planning as a permaculture practitioner, or really anyone, is that while we're cognizant of these ideas that we should be putting together our plans early, once we know what it is that we want to do, from where we want to be buried to how we want to be buried or to be handled at the end of life. And there was something that you had mentioned in our conversation setting up this interview about an advanced directive. Is that something you could speak more about?
Absolutely, and it's a great place to start because, all this sounds groovy, but then people are like, well, how do I get this conversation started? And it's not an easy conversation to have with a lot of people, even if you're open-minded, and you're wanting to, get your parents to, begin considering this, your grandparents. Really, anybody who's 18 years of older should be working on having something written. And the rights, when you die, you still have the first rights. If you have something written, you have first rights in what happens after you die. And then if you don't, it goes to, the next of kin. But you still have the first rights. Now, an advanced directive is a legal document, I think in almost all states. That's actually very common. A lot of doctors' offices or hospitals, have those. And it's very basic, but it states, what happens if you're on life support. Do you want, to have the plug pulled, under ABC circumstances. So it's kind of a very simple document that takes the weight off of somebody else, your loved ones, making a decision for you in the case that you're, unconscious or in a coma. There's a project, a nonprofit in Florida called Aging with Dignity. I think it's agingwithdignity.org. And they have created an advanced directive called 5 Wishes. Now, it's also legally binding, I think, in almost all states. There might be 4 or 5 where 5 Wishes is not legally binding. But it's a wonderful document. You can download it for free from their site or pay a couple bucks and they'll mail it to you. And it's an advanced directive, but with it's like a holistic one in the sense that it asks detailed questions. What kind of environment do you want to have around you when you die? How do you want to be buried? Under what circumstances, as well as your medical choices, if you are not capable of making them. So it really kind of clearly states your wishes and intentions for around your passing. And I think this is potentially even more important for your loved ones than it is for yourself, because you're taking the weight off of them for having to make very hard decisions for you. So I think it's critical that everybody does this for their loved ones, for themselves and for their loved ones. And it's quite simple document, and it's also a nice way to begin a conversation. So what Aging with Dignity suggests is that you fill one out yourself, get familiar with it, then take it to your loved ones, your parents, whoever, and you'll have a good starting place for a conversation. I think most people are open to planning, even if they're not really comfortable talking about death. They might be open to just kind of planning. But the five wishes adds a little bit more in, so that you can maybe get the conversation open a little more. And then I find in talking about death, which I do a lot now because I see the need for us culturally to be having the conversation, and whatever that conversation is, I don't try to dictate what it's going to be, but just let's talk about it. Let's open that up, shake ourselves loose a little bit. It's inevitable for all of us. So the five wishes is a nice, easy way to begin that process in conversations. Highly recommend getting that. I buy them by the box. You can get like 25 for $25, and then I give them to people. And I'll buy another box and try to keep spreading this small awareness.
As that gets the word out there, it becomes more of a common part of our practices, and that even though you may give that to someone who doesn't use it, that they can take that as an opportunity to speak with someone else about what they're learning about these end-of-life practices.
Yeah, and when I hold talks, when I do public talks about natural burial, they're very well attended. But they're very well attended by people in their 60s, in their 70s, maybe a younger person here and there. And I think that's too bad. Hopefully we will all live into an old age, but a lot of us will not. And I think, not, sort of preparing for it now is erroneous and really kind of puts a lot of weight on your loved ones and on the environment. So if you're 18, you're 20, you're 25, you feel healthy, strong, death isn't on your radar, you still should be, making these small efforts, because these small efforts can make a huge difference in the advent, the inevitable, your inevitable death. So please don't discredit this because you don't see yourself as a candidate, because you are.
There are two other notes that I have from when we were putting our interview together that I wanted to make sure that we covered. One of those was death cafes, and the other was green burials. You can take either one that you'd like and go ahead and start with it. We'll make sure that we hit both of those.
So death cafes, I believe, was begun in the UK, in England. And it's a very simple gathering that's held all over the world and all over the country. You can probably go to, Death Cafe's website and see where these cafes are being held. We've had them held locally at our college, and I went, and it was in a large atrium, and there were, maybe a dozen large round tables, and you just came in and you sat down, and whoever was at the table, people you hadn't met usually, and the idea, and they had pastries and coffee and tea for you, and then the concept is that you just talk about you talk about whatever you want to talk about. It's a conversation about death and dying process, and it's beautiful in the sense that everybody that's there is wanting to talk in some aspect about death and dying, and it just creates the space for it. It's so simple and so beautiful, and yet was really kind of amazing, just to be with other people who are aware and wanting to talk and further the conversation and learn from each other and listen to each other. It's so simple, and yet it's so powerful, and it's a huge success, Death Cafes, I think, just because it is creating opportunity for us to talk about it. So look for those opportunities, or maybe potentially sponsor one. You can sponsor one yourself, put it together in your region, and that's another great way to to help this movement happen culturally. And then, of course, you can add in information. When I was there, I shared our process of doing home burial. And people were like, "Wow, I didn't know you could do that." And so it's another opportunity to share options with folks. So that's Death Cafes. Green burial. There's a Green Burial Council. This is a national certifying organization that works with existing cemeteries and new green cemeteries. So a lot of times, a lot of the options now for green burial are hybrids, which means that a conventional cemetery has allocated a certain area to green burial. Now the Green Burial Council also has, to be certified, you have to meet certain requirements. And number one is you don't use embalming fluid with toxic chemicals in it. Interestingly enough, they've developed an embalming fluid made out of essential oils, that's non-toxic. If you feel like you still need to go that route. I didn't mention earlier, I should throw in there, that one of the ways that we were able to keep my father and my grandmother at home for 3 days was dry ice. So dry ice keeps the body cold and somewhat preserved, as does embalming fluid. So dry ice is usually locally available, and it's quite easy and simple to use, and that kept the body probably decomposing more inside. So that's one of the key ingredients to keeping somebody at home after they've transitioned is dry ice. So in the green burial, you can't use any kind of casket that has exotic woods, metals. You can a shroud. We wrapped my grandmother in a quilt, her favorite quilt, and buried her in a quilt. But there's actually, interestingly, large market out there for green caskets, things made out of woven willow. Or another friends of ours, use some locally sawn milled wood to build a little poplar casket for their loved one. So that's a requirement for the green burials. You have to have some kind of natural, very easily biodegradable casket. Cardboard caskets are actually quite popular as well. And this is nice cardboard that you can paint and you can draw on. And it gives another opportunity for loved ones to do something and to offer and celebrate their love for that person, painting it, which is kind of cool. I've seen some cool images of that. So and then you cannot have a concrete liner put over your grave as part of green burial. And I think that's the main tenements. Oh, you can't have like a traditional headstone, because the idea is that you're also preserving the environment to look as natural as possible. And so, local stones are often used, probably engrave a stone or have a flat stone on the ground engraved. So you're not marring the look of the place. So there's hybrid cemeteries, and then there's conservation cemeteries. Conservation cemeteries is like their highest certification standard, where as agreeance that you're going to have a conservation cemetery, green cemetery, is that you're going to do plantings as well. So you're going to have either an allocated area that's for reforestation, or maybe you will. I've heard of green cemeteries having areas where people are buried, and then when one section is filled, they'll start to plant over that section, and then they'll move on to the next section. So it's using burial, as a segue into reforestation and conservation, which is great. It has to follow each other if you're going to do conservation, green burial. And interestingly enough, I'm working with a couple of friends in exploring creating a green cemetery here in Maryland, where we do not have one. I think there's a hybrid option in Maryland. That's it. They are popping up, and there's a couple in Pennsylvania. There's one near Pittsburgh, Penn Forest, North Carolina. There's a permaculture one. What's the name of that place, Scott?
That's Sparkroot Farm.
Sparkroot Farm. Yeah, they're on Instagram too. They're doing really amazing cultural work and permaculture. And then there's Washington State, Herland. I've seen their advertising in the permaculture magazines that they're advertising their green burial on their site, which I think is really interesting, because a lot of permaculturists and people who are looking to sort of live regeneratively are trying to figure out how to do it economically. Some people are doing bed and breakfasts. It's not easy to sort of set yourself up on a piece of land and stay on the land and make your income from the land. And I think adding an element of green burial to your homestead is a very economically practical way to fund living and staying on the land. It's one income stream. Of course, have diversity of income streams, but I don't think it's one that's considered enough. and I hear and I've met other people, who do different green burial aspects on their properties as a way of their living. And another thing I didn't throw out there is that green burial is very inexpensive. Even if you're paying, to be buried in a green burial site, you're paying maybe $1,500, maybe up to $3,000 total. So the cost is considerably less to be buried in a green burial site as well. So it's a environmental and economic benefit there. So Green Burial Council has an informative website and a lot of information about that. And we're exploring within our own county, the regulations. And so far, we're not really finding any troubles. I've been talking to the permit office, and we're actually surprisingly allowed, to have cemeteries on R1, which is residential, like suburbia. If you live in suburbia, you potentially could have a cemetery. I found that interesting. Ag land, of course, and then there's RC, which is like a religious, already an existing church or a nonprofit. So almost all statuses for us, and it's probably going to vary site to site. And the process around here is that it has to go through a review through the permit office to make sure that it's all groovy, and then it has to go through a public review where it will be posted that this is going to be a cemetery site, and there's a certain amount of time that anybody who has concern can speak up. And so that's where you kind of are rolling the dice to see if, in Baltimore County, next to us, there was an attempt to create a green cemetery, and the neighbors made a stink, and, uneducated about the realities. They got scared, and so it wasn't able to happen. So the public does have a say in this. So, choosing your land wisely in hopes that no one's going to rebuff it. But otherwise, it's pretty clear and straightforward. Now, there's another issue that the government, I think this is across the country, there's a perpetuity fund. It's set up, I think, since 97, where if you're going to start a new cemetery, you have to put a certain amount of money into this fund. You'll never see that money. It's either $10,000 to $50,000, depending on how large the cemetery is going to be. And it makes sense. It's a perpetuity fund in case, your entity, if you're a nonprofit or a business, that started the cemetery dissolves. It's a fund to help preserve and maintain that space for all the people who would still want to come and visit their loved ones. But that can be, a crippling challenge economically up front. But there's another loophole that if there's an abandoned cemetery, which there's lots of, then you don't need to put money into that perpetuity fund. You probably don't have to go through all the hoops and loops of worrying, about the review process, because it already exists. And there's a lot of these. Interestingly enough, I met a man yesterday in a conversation who lives near here, who says he's got an old cemetery on his property, and he's interested in having me come out and talk to him. And maybe we'll be able to sort of, slide right into this process through that. Otherwise, it's definitely going to be, some hop and scotch and to set up a green cemetery. But it's important work. This affects lives in so many ways that I feel like it's worth the efforts that any of us can put into it.
And with the home burials that you're doing on your property, that is separate from a full commercial cemetery, so you did not need the perpetuity fund?
Correct. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't specify that. So the green burial, that's kind of a public cemetery. It's a public institution. But no, on our home burial site, there is no perpetuity fund. The only thing that was required was the setbacks from water and the plat, so that there is always an easement to access to it. So let's say our land is sold to somebody else. They will own the land where the cemetery is, but they cannot do anything with that section of it. And then we will always have legal access to come visit that space or come and bury more people there, in perpetuity.
And so that plat and that easement is just a separate legal construct that you have a deed for that kind of separates that land out a little from whoever happens to own the physical property in the future?
Correct. So even if you think, that you're not going to stay on the land you're on, you could still create your home cemetery there and have that space. And you do not need a lot of acreage. The only limitations in our area were the 100-foot setback from a well. And if you're on city water, if you're on some kind of, not necessarily city water, but if you're on some kind of, piped in water, then the setbacks are even less. And so I think you potentially could be creating a home cemetery on something, as small as half an acre, potentially a third, maybe even a quarter if the spacing is right. So don't think that you need a large piece of property to do this, because you will save a lot of money and get all these other benefits, from creating this space, even in a small lot.
And I think for anybody who's done any kind of construction or worked with agricultural regulations or anything like that, if you've looked up that coding, then you're familiar with these same kinds of offsets, because you've probably encountered them, if you went to build a barn that it has to be so many feet from a residential structure, or what your setbacks are for fencing from a roadway, that it's those same kinds of considerations. It's just a matter of talking to the right people to know what those considerations are before you move forward with a project like this.
Yeah, absolutely, and that was from the permit office. That was their only thing, was that it had construction setbacks, which were 10 feet from the border, so they were very minimal. So the two steps I would take is I'd call the health department first and be patient, because sometimes they may not be accustomed to this, but they will have it somewhere in their laws. So call your health department, have them come out, look at the proposed site, and then if you get a green light from them, then you get a surveyor. You can't call the permit office and say you want them to come look at the site. I don't think they're going to come out and look. They're not going to be interested other than filing it for you. So really, you kind of do the legwork on your own. You get the health department okay, then you get a plat made, then you register that plat, and that's it. At least it was for us. Now, it might vary state to state, even county to county.
And it is one of those things, as you say, to be patient. I find very often, having done some policy work, that where we think rules and regulations may be is not where we'll find them. One example that comes to mind is with chickens, that in one local city here in Pennsylvania, that chickens in the city were not under agricultural ordinances where we thought they would be, but rather were under nuisance ordinances, because that's where they were disallowed. And so when someone's asked a question like this that they're not familiar with, that it may take some time and some research. And also, for anybody who's interested in this, I recommend looking for your township or county codes online and do as much research as you can. Search for things like cemetery, funeral home, or anything like that that's related to death and dying, because then you might be able to forward that information onto whoever you're reaching out to and give them an opportunity to kind of speed up their research.
Yeah, you absolutely. And I think the Home Funeral Alliance and organizations like that will also have a lot of resources for that. And yeah, in preparation for my grandmother dying, she was living in a retirement community, kind of a highbrow spot. And so, we had to call them and say, look, this is what we're planning on doing, because I didn't go through one step. So when my father passed, that morning, the hospice nurse came out and, confirmed that he had passed. And then she went back to the hospice doctor, and he signed the death certificate. And she brought that back. So my dad never had to go anywhere, no processing other than this nurse, bringing the document back. And she left us with the death certificate. Now, the first page of the death certificate is signed by the doctor, time of death, da-da-da-da. Then the second page, I believe it's the second page, it's all written for a funeral director, which is kind of telling. But what you do is you act as funeral director. You fill it in as the funeral director. Every time it says funeral director, you put in your name, and you just fill out the second page. And then the third page is a transportation document. And again, it's saying funeral director, has the right to move the body from A to B, da 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 da. And you just put your own name in there, and you need that document, because we had to move my grandmother from her retirement community, just down the road, up to our family home. And in preparation for that, we saw it coming, so we called up the retirement community, and we're like, look, this is what we're planning on doing. We want to give you guys a heads up. I know this is not, at all what has ever been done. And it took them a little while to digest it and to come to terms with it, and so that was helpful. And then we began caring for my grandmother there, but then, a friend had a hatchback Subaru, and, we wrapped her in the same way on a board, very simple board, in a quilt, and, as quickly and carefully as we could. We carried her outside and put her in the back of the Subaru and, drove her up to our home and placed her in a living room. So you are allowed to transport, in most circumstances. I think you're even allowed to transport across state lines. And I want to check on that, but I've heard plenty of stories of people, driving loved ones up from Florida to Maryland or, vice versa. And it might be an additional document, but if surprisingly, you can do this. You act as a funeral director. You take all those roles. And then, of course, you have to file those papers yourself within a short amount of time, but that's pretty basic as well. So that was really the only major legal thing that we had to deal with, and it was very simple for us. Now, if your loved one dies at the hospital, this is also, and if you foresee that coming, you should start having a conversation with the hospital, because they are not accustomed to having anybody interfere with their process, even though you are legally allowed to. So you need to really be clear up front that your intentions are that, when your loved one dies in the hospital, that you are going to come take them, and you are going to put them in your car, and you are going to drive them home. And you want to, set that up as much in advance as possible. They legally have to in most circumstances. They just may not know it. So you need to be patient, but you need to be persistent. You need to be clear, and maybe have some documentation with you that helps support that. Otherwise, they're going to stick you down in the morgue, and they're going to run you through the conventional process. And I don't want that for any of my loved ones. I know that. So it definitely do some legwork. Be prepared. These are not things you want to try and deal with when it's happening for the first time, because you're emotionally, tied up. You're mentally not clear. So a little bit of legwork helps.
Yeah, and having gone through some end-of-life planning myself with my own family this summer, I can say how much time and energy goes into that while you're dealing with someone who is ill and trying to take care of them as best you can, your family as best you can, and prepare for these next steps. So, yeah, definitely do that. And then, Michael, do you have time for a few listener questions before we draw this to a close and I ask you for your final thoughts?
Sure. Fire away.
From Jessica, and I think we covered some of this, but just to make sure we've got it all, she asked, what would be the process for acquiring land and establishing an eco-cemetery, such as zoning and land use laws? She's interested in creating a conservation-type space, which you mentioned, with room for reforestation and wildlife rehabilitation among the grave-based green spaces. Are there some organizations that are articulating into these areas already?
Yeah, so the Green Burial Council, definitely. Well, the Green Burial Council has certifications that you have to meet, but I think even before that, in considering looking for land, you'd want to, talk to your permit office, your health department, and your permit office. You may have to get, hydrological testing on the land to make sure that you don't have a high water table. So there might need to be, a step taken there. You want to make sure that, you're not in a floodplain. The county's going to want to make sure that the land drains and isn't going to create a potential hazard. So I think, that's one of the first main considerations. It doesn't really want to be too steep or hilly. You want people to be able to enjoy it. A lot of these conservation green burial places, cemeteries, are becoming parks. So the idea is that you come and you enjoy yourself, your time there. There's walking paths, there's benches, there's places to have picnics. It's a place to come together, celebrate, be with your loved ones in some essence in a peaceful place. So it really kind of ties a lot of great things together when you're doing the conservation burial part of it. But I think initially you need to make sure that your land is going to be suitable, and the permit office and the health department are probably your first starting bets there. You have to have consideration for size, how big an area, based on, how many, economically, how's it going to work for you. There's certain things the county's going to want to make sure that there's room enough for people to park off street, be able to turn around inside that space. Interesting enough, I was talking to this gentleman yesterday who has the abandoned cemetery, and he's like, he considered it. He's like, I couldn't see 200 people coming in for a funeral. And I said, well, you can create limitations yourself. You could say, okay, if you want to be buried here, we're going to have a limit of 50 people for your ceremony, and fair enough. If you agree to all these things, so I think you can also up front, put in the design and limitations for your site and your cemetery so that they really suit your lifestyle and the space. So keep that in mind, that I think there's a lot of flexibility here and creativity. A great place and a website to look at is Penn Forest, Penn Forest. And they're there, Scott, in your state. They're near Pittsburgh. And he's a wonderful guy who's really done a good job in setting up a conservation green burial cemetery. And he's got goats and bees there. He's creating, these walking paths and his planting. He's really done a good job, and he's very generous in sharing his information and how he's done it. I think he's a good model. I need to get up there and visit him here soon, of how it can be done, and even economically the planning for it as well. Yeah, it's just start researching and digging in and talking to your permit office. Go in and sit with them and talk with them and see what has happened with other cemeteries being created in the area and learn from their processes as well.
And then Linda, one of the Patreon supporters of the podcast, had recently run across an article from the New York Times about turning corpses into compost as part of the Urban Death Project. And one thing that she brought up in there is that the article didn't address was about scavengers. And that was one of the things that I had, especially when you said earlier about only digging, I guess you said about 4 feet deep. Are scavengers or anything like that a concern with this type of burial?
I mean, I don't know anything that's going to dig 4 feet out around here. So, no, I've not heard of that really being a concern. I mean, maybe if you lived out where there was a bunch of coyotes or something, and you didn't bury very deep, but I don't think animals are going to dig that much. I think if that was really a concern, you could probably lay in some hardware cloth or some chicken wire as a layer, above the buried person. But I think ideally you're burying as high up in the topsoil as possible, where it's biologically and fungal rich. The deeper you go into the subsoil, the less biological activity is there, and the longer the decomposition process is going to take. So, I was reading some regulations the other day. In a lot of states, they only, some states only need 18 inches above yourself or your casket or whatever. I think 3 feet is more the average, but it's not very much, surprisingly. The 6 feet under thing, maybe in New Mexico, I think New Mexico there was only one that was like 72 inches. Maybe it's because they got coyotes out there. But, surprisingly, and that was one of the things I was surprised that no one was coming out and looking at how deep we dug and all that. And, I think we maybe went 4 feet. I think 3 feet would be fine and have some benefits to it. So the second part, though, Linda's question there on the Urban Death Project, I'm glad she mentioned that. That is an awesome project that's been underway maybe about 2 years now, headed by a woman, I think, out in Washington State, who is creating, she did a Kickstarter too. I think she raised like $100,000 for research involving universities. I think even North Carolina University is very involved with her. And it's basically creating these towers in urban settings. And the idea is that it's, you go up to the top, top tower, and there's a hole in the floor, and it's full of wood chips, it's full of organic matter, and you lay your loved one, with a natural biodegradable shroud on top of that. And then this tower, which I don't know how tall it might be, 20, 30 feet maybe or more, has this slow composting process as it goes down. And, more people are buried on the top, and it's just their bodies are going down through this composting layer over time in a very small space. So it's like this natural process of decomposition in an urban environment, which is great. And they're doing the research and testing, for the possible chemical outcomes and, how can this be safe? And they've had, as far as I know, huge success. I don't know where it is in legal processing state by state, but they're very well organized. They've got funding. I'm on their email list, so I keep getting updates, which is really, really fascinating to hear about. So it's really this kind of idea of home burial, and for people who don't have land. So it's an awesome project that I would definitely check out. So again, if you're living in the city, you think, oh, I don't have any land to do this. There are other possibilities.
And Kendra was wondering, do you have any information on how to remediate or work with existing graveyards because of all the chemicals and things that we might perceive as toxic within that environment?
That's a good one. I mean, traditional cemeteries are basically landfills, embalming chemicals and cement, kind of this monoculture of headstones. And, bioremediation, fungi are our best bet. working with mycelium to break down and convert toxins. The fungi will actually convert toxins and chemicals into sugars, not heavy metals. You can't convert heavy metals. Fungi will hold them, lock them up, but they can't convert them. But I think a lot of the chemicals that are in the embalming fluid can probably be digested. So things that come to my mind are just incorporating as much organic matter on that site as possible. Wood chipping over the graves, heavily, and then strawing over that, or something that maybe is aesthetically acceptable, and just trying to enrich that soil biota and the fungi and the breakdown to help manage those chemicals. Maybe doing some earthworks. If you have a lot of water moving into the site, off-site, maybe doing swales slightly off contour. Maybe move some of that heavy flowing water just off to the side and then capture it there. Try to reduce the amount of water flushing through that area comes to mind. Unfortunately, in the concrete, it'll eventually break down, but it's kind of damage done right up front. That's a little bit harder to ameliorate in hindsight. But, those two things come to mind is easy permaculture practices.
And the final question that we have is from Terrence, and is a little bit more lighthearted. And he's wondering, have you picked out an inscription for your own tombstone?
I should. I've got my 5 wishes. I've got that very detailed. I voiced I think everyone, obviously, my family and my life knows what I want. But the tombstone, I don't know. Something about being, a plantsman. Just something about my love of working with plants and systems. I don't know. It doesn't have to say much at all. Like my dad's stone, just has his name and his birth date and the day that he transitioned. So, like I say, with my grandmother, it's just a bird bath at this point. So, no, I haven't thought about that aspect of it, but I guess it's good to be clear about all these things to make it easy for those, once you're gone. That's the idea. No, I'll think on that one.
And if you do come to something, definitely let us know, and I can let Terrence hear what that is.
Put him at ease. All right. Yeah, I'll see what I can come up with. Hopefully I've got some time. We'll see.
With everything that we've covered today in talking about making space for the dying and holding them, for the rituals that come with end of life and transitioning, and all the different ways that we can approach care for the earth and the body and the community afterwards, do you have anything else to share for this conversation today, Michael?
Wow, I feel like we really put a lot out there. I think there's a lot of good resources to follow. I would say try not to be afraid of death and being around death. I've also found an amazing portal to explore, the metaphysical, aspects of being alive. I find death comparable to, ceremony with ayahuasca and peyote, and, these openings into, deeper understanding. When you sit with death, you are entering space that is just an amazing place to learn and to grow. To where I think, if I feel like I really need an opportunity to do some real searching, then I'll be with death. I'll go and be close to people who are dying. I'll be in that space. And it's a huge opportunity for growth. It's a great opportunity that we're not using, we're squandering. So, try not to be afraid of death. And culturally, we've become that way. But try to look at it as an opportunity, a huge, wonderful opportunity that can bring a lot to your life, ironically, by creating a close relationship with death.
Well, thank you for that and everything else that you shared with us today. And thank you for joining me for this conversation, Michael.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate you, man.
And that was Michael Judd. Find out more about him at ecologiadesign.com. As I referred to early in this episode, I've spent a lot of this year considering and dealing with end-of-life care. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk with Michael when he reached out to me about this subject. I see preparing for our end and including our loved ones in those conversations as early as possible as essential to our work as permaculture practitioners, both as human beings with relationships with people who we love, but also because of the design that we practice, regardless of what level or degree you might take your design to. If your focus is primarily on farm and land, then setting aside a place to hold and honor the dead is essential. If your design work takes you beyond the landscape, then what ways can you start the conversation with family members, friends, and your community? Can you take the ideas presented here of home burial, of a 3-day wake, as Michael held for his father, and apply them where you are? Or do you have different cultural hallmarks that mark the transition from life, just as they're your own for entering it? I don't know anyone for whom death and dying is an easy conversation, but it is one that we should be having, as designers, as friends, and as family members, to help others honor their wishes and so that we can be clear with our own. If you have thoughts on this and would like to talk about them, or need some space for someone to listen as you seek closure, my door is always open. 717-827-6266, show@thepermaculturepodcast.com, or The Permaculture Podcast, P.O. Box 16, Dauphin, Pennsylvania, 17018. Spend each day taking care of Earth, yourself, and your community.